Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. Today's episode is part of our special series, Making a Difference, Supply Chains for a Better Tomorrow. Now, the current COVID-19 pandemic is creating many supply chain disruptions for companies and organizations all around the world, but it's also serving as a catalyst for change and innovation. So what supply chain capabilities will separate the leaders from the laggards, not only in response to this current crisis, but to position yourselves for success over the long term? Well, that's the main question we're going to focus in the series. And it's great to have John back in the program with us to kind of share his insights and perspective on this topic. And so John, welcome back to the program.
Appreciate coming back.
And so John, you're the Vice President of Supply Chain Analytics at Transportation Insight, and you were our guest on the program here not too long ago. But it's incredible, it's just been a few weeks, but it's incredible how things have changed just in a matter of weeks, right?
Oh yeah, I mean it's like a different world, and every day you wake up and it's a new challenge, a new opinion, and everybody's saying, well, what's next?
Exactly. So, and that's really the question, what's next, right? Because I think, and that's really what we're trying to do with this series is, obviously there's the here and now and how to navigate successfully through this, but, we got to also be thinking about longer term and how can we, take this, less than ideal situation and convert it into something that's going to be positive, over the long term. So as a way to get started, I mean, like I said, the COVID-19 crisis is disrupting, many supply chains, but it's also accelerating a lot of the trends that have been happening, for a number of years now, in particular, e-commerce, right? So what impact or challenges is this creating for companies?
I think the biggest thing is companies trying to figure out what's going to be temporary and what's permanent. We're just in this bit of chaos right now where everybody's got an opinion, but nobody really knows who's right. And so I think the challenge is that companies are going to have to completely think differently. Saw an article this morning that said, hey, we shouldn't forecast anymore. It should be all about demand sensing. Okay, well, in our last call, we talked about how change is hard for companies and change management. And so now we're not talking about changing a process, changing a system. We're talking about having to change how you think. And I think companies have to figure out how do I make my supply chain agile?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think in many ways we almost have to, and I remember writing a blog post about this a few years back, but it was calling, I was talking about having to unlearn, some of the things that we've learned in the past, right? Because, some of the things that might have worked, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, as this environment continues to evolve and change, as these trends that we talk about continues to evolve and change, it's kind of common sense that, yesterday's rules for success and ways of thinking may not be the best aligned with, the current environment and the way things are going to be, the operating realities of the future. And certainly, when you look at something like e-commerce, it's been growing, strongly for a few years now, but a lot of now retailers that probably smaller retailers that probably weren't doing e-commerce that, have their stores closed. Now, the only way they can generate revenue is through either curbside pickups or order online and pick up at the store, or they're, trying to stand up, e-commerce operations. And many of them are trying to do that, right now. So that's creating some, challenges as well as opportunities for them, right?
Yeah, you almost expect to see people on roller skates, coming out of the store, going back to the 50s.
Yeah, no, exactly. Actually, I've seen that some of the restaurants here are planning to have outdoor seating and do almost like the old 50s style, drive up, someone on roller skates going up to the car window to take the order and deliver the food. So yeah, in some cases, it might be Back to the Future in some ways. So what changes should then companies make in light of everything that, that's happening now and as they begin to think about the future? I mean, what changes should they start making to position themselves for success moving forward?
I think, we talk about the supply chain a lot, and the supply chain has this connotation to it that it's sequential. And we've seen with all the e-commerce development over the last several years that, you take something like drop ship. Well, now you're not being sequential. You're skipping steps. And so even though I don't think we've been calling it, it's more become a web. And so you think about how you would interact in an environment where, you can go backwards and forwards and around. And so I think, for success, you got to start thinking about it that way. So it's not just the physical flow of goods, it's also the information flow. I can't tell you how many articles we're reading right now that say, hey, you need to be talking to your tier 3 suppliers and providing them information. And so, if you think about the concept of this web, if your operations in the center and the left half of the web is supply and the right half is demand, figuring out, well, what can go around the arc. We're talking about dual sourcing, which of the radials do you really need to reinforce with other options. And then you think about how if a spider is sitting in the center of this web, that they sense any vibration anywhere in the web. And that's what companies want right now. You want that visibility to know, if I'm essential, but 2 tiers up, I've got a supplier that's not, what's that going to mean? Or that one of them shuts down because of a COVID outbreak.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think when you look at, what's happening right now is that, I think what this crisis is uncovering is the fact that there's so much interdependencies between so many of the different stakeholders in the supply chain, or now let's call the supply web. And, a lot of these historical problems, like not having visibility past tier 1 suppliers, that's having those companies that are, blind basically, or that's a black hole for them, are having the hardest problems right now, navigating, through this crisis. And I think, we talk a lot about being agile and flexible and responsive. And a lot of that really is about finding those opportunities where you can operate in a more, less linear way, right? A less serial way where you can actually skip some steps, right? Do a DC bypass, for example, drop shipping, like you talked about, direct to consumer, whatever the case might be. There's so many now permutations that are possible to, again, bring down costs, bring down time, be able to respond to any kind of disruptions in a more intelligent way. And I think that's going to require, again, like you said, thinking about it not from a kind of a linear step-by-step approach, not only physically, as you said, the movement of goods in a linear way, but also the movement of information. I think one of the things that we've talked about in the industry now for some time as part of this digital transformation that everyone's been talking about is the ability to provide more transparency to everyone that are key stakeholders in the end-to-end process. And, rather than be waiting for information to get to you, is being able to expose that information, in a more real-time, manner, so that everyone's making, smarter decisions faster, right?
Yeah, and you think about, for companies that maybe they did have to shut down a DC or something for one reason or another in a particular area of the country, having those really strong partnerships that they could step in and say, well, hey, okay, now maybe we do drop ship, and you're being able to maintain a lot of that top line revenue to keep everything going, but really leveraging, partners.
Right. And I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is companies almost standing up completely new supply chains and supply webs, if you will, from scratch, right? So you've seen companies, you've seen kind of the automotive companies, building ventilators, right? So now it's completely different raw materials coming in, different end customers in terms of hospitals and medical centers and so forth. And they're doing this, relatively quickly, right, in response to, the current crisis. But I think if you kind of expand that, I think that's a model that might be, how do you create that in a sustainable way so that you're able not in a crisis environment, but more from a business opportunity standpoint, to be able to stand up a supply chain, a supply web very quickly to take advantage of a market opportunity, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, and I hope this, if we can find a bright spot in all of this of, we've seen people stepping up and being more neighborly and really trying to take care of everyone. And we've talked about collaboration in the supply chain for a long time, but maybe now's the time that we really are going to look at how do we keep it balanced? How do we truly be good partners with our suppliers and our customers?
Absolutely, absolutely. So then, I guess the next logical question is, how do you begin this transformation from a supply chain to a supply web? I mean, what are some of the key steps?
I think you have to literally map your supply network and your customer network. Maybe it's bringing in a partner, maybe you've got the resources internally, but actually start interrogating, that's a horrible word to use on this, but, talking to your vendors and sharing information to find out about their vendors, and figuring out, what information can you share? What are you comfortable? And then go through a modeling exercise, understand, not only, cost and service, but risk. And so what are really the important things to evaluate, and how are you going to, weight some of these different measures that maybe we wouldn't have done before, to determine where do you need to enhance relationships, or where do you have visibility gaps, and then develop a plan. Develop some contingency plans, talking about the essential and these stand-up supply webs. Do you have a plan for what would you do if your primary, demand drops? So I think it's a lot of really reinforcing your relationships, mapping them out, and developing a contingency plan to address these crazy times.
When you talk about supply chain mapping, I mean, that's something that we've written about as well. Actually, we did some research on that with our Indago research community earlier this year. And, I guess not surprising, we asked a question. I mean, do you know where the physical location of the plants or the sourcing locations of your suppliers, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3? And, I guess not surprising, most of the respondents, I think over 3/4 said that they knew the physical location of the facilities of their tier 1 suppliers. But then when you went to tier 2 and tier 3, that percentage went down. But then we asked the follow-up question, which was, well, it's one thing to know where those physical locations are, but do you actually know what's produced, which parts or raw materials are actually produced at each of those locations? And again, the percentages were higher for tier 1 versus tier 2 and tier 3, but those percentages were lower, right, than even so they may know where the facilities are, but they may not necessarily know what components or parts or raw materials are actually produced at those facilities. So I think that, to your point, I think that's one of those areas where, it's kind of a logical starting point. It's not something that's easy to do, but it's something that's been long overdue, right?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's lots of opportunities there that you may uncover, but you're absolutely right. Even with a lot of the network design type projects I've done, understanding where they're getting their components coming in, especially if they're coming in from overseas. Are you really sure which country? And then not only that, which port are they coming through? And particularly if they're coming in prepaid, can't tell you how many is going back to our other conversation, but the address for the suppliers downtown Chicago. Yeah, probably not on the 30th floor,
No, that's a great point. And that's something that actually one of our members, Indago members, said as part of that research. They said, what they found was in their ERP system, the address that they had in the ERP system was for like the headquarters, not for the actual manufacturing plant or facility where their products are actually, produced or sourced from. So I think that is a good starting point. I think when you talk about contingency plans, for a lot of companies historically, that's been another area that they've fallen short on, because they've kind of treated risk management as kind of this project, a one-off type of thing. So something like this happens, this pandemic happens, they put a team together, they figure out, okay, where did we go wrong? What could we have done better? They put together a report, they put it in a binder, and then they put that binder up on the shelf, and then they forget about it, right? Until the next, disruption occurs, and then everyone's taking off the binders and dusting it off. But I think the companies that are really, ahead of the curve are those that are really treating this as an ongoing business process. Do you see the same?
Mm-hmm. I hope so, but yeah, I'm used to that shelfware, that it just goes up on the shelf because either the change was hard or, wow, this really cost a lot. But, again, I think the low cost solution anymore is not where we want to be, because we have to be able to protect that top line. You still have to be able to get it out. If you can't even get your product out to bring in the top line, it doesn't really matter how much cost you're cutting out.
That's right. That's right. I think the knee-jerk reaction in these times is to tighten the belt and cut as much cost as possible. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of companies fall into that trap, and it's understandable why they fall into that trap. But at the same time, I think from past history, it's those companies that also continue to invest in innovation, continue to invest in the future, are those that, when we turn the corner on these things, they're the ones that are, much better positioned and shaped to, really come back up than those that only focus on cost cutting and let go a lot of people, stopped investing in technology, didn't maintain their relationships as you just talked about, and so forth. So, that leads me to, I guess, to another question. I mean, is managing a supply web different than managing a supply chain? And if so, what's required from like a people and technology standpoint?
There's a part of me that says it's not that much different, and other than you've got a whole lot more options. But I think you've got to be prepared to be more transparent. You've got to be providing more communication. And then you've got to have the technology to do that. Going back in my past with the retailer I was with, they had a portal that suppliers could log into and look at what their products were doing in a particular store. So they could really get real-time demand sensing, but not everybody has that. And so how do you develop that? How do you share the information? How do you get the information back from them? And then how do you use it? I've been, oddly enough, playing the beer game a lot lately. And I don't mean the one with quarters, but, we've really been, playing these games and looking at what does it mean when you don't have visibility? What does it mean to the manufacturer that he doesn't know all of a sudden the retailer went crazy, toilet paper, and jacked up their demand, and all of a sudden he's just going to be out of stock and back ordered. Where if they understood what was going on there, everybody could react better. And so, I think it does come back to that partnership, and that for the benefit of everyone, maybe for one particular, person playing in that supply web, they don't have the lowest cost, but overall everyone's winning. And so therefore long-term, everyone would win.
Right. Yeah, that's great. That beer game is a classic game, and it's a great example of the bullwhip effect, which I think, which is very, we definitely saw with, toilet paper and other things, in supermarkets, over this period now. So then how do you measure, success then? I mean, in other words, what are the benefits of adopting a supply web perspective and approach? And can you give some examples?
Now, I think the biggest benefit is going to be you can maintain your operation, that you can react to disruptions either in, from a customer perspective in the way of increased or decreased demand, as well as disruption, on your supplier base. So, if you had all of your suppliers in China and all of a sudden a port shut down, can you react to that? If you're dual sourcing in multiple geographies, albeit maybe not at the lowest cost, Well, but you're able to maintain operations because you've developed those relationships. And so, the first, success factor would be continuity of business. And so the other ones I think would be the enhanced visibility. If you are really able to sense and react, even in non-disruptive times, that's what's going to be the big benefit of this. And of course, ultimately is with all business, top line revenue and bottom line revenue. You can't leave those out. But kind of like we said a minute ago, if you can't sell, it doesn't matter how much cost you cut.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it still comes down to having that visibility and that transparency and being able to, provide that in a more real-time basis to, the extended, stakeholders across the web that you've, put together. It comes down to relationships. And yes, business continuity. I mean, I think, being able to, we've always talked about, the importance of being flexible and agile and responsive, like I said before. And I think, this is where, in these types of environments that we're in today, it's really where you clearly see why that's so important, because it's been those companies that have been able to, quickly turn that ship, quickly turn that corner and keep their business going as best they can, or at a minimum better than the competitors, at least, to capture market share and continue to keep their people safe, their people employed, keep their suppliers healthy and their customers, and supporting their customers. I mean, I think those are the ones that are going to come out of all of this, as strong as possible. So John, as a way to, wrap up, I mean, are there other, trends that manufacturers and retailers should keep on their radar screens to, keep driving change, keep innovating and improving their supply chains? I mean, their supply webs.
So, I think the one of the big things is investing in technology and leveraging the advanced analytics that are coming into vogue, being able to leverage AI and what that means and more sensing. I was on a webinar recently and someone made the comment that companies coming out of this will see more return on investing in technology and data than they will in infrastructure. We've got a lot of infrastructure to work with throughout the supply web, but having the technology to really analyze it and capitalize on it when you think, okay, well, forecasting isn't going to work anymore, maybe, but we've talked a lot about the essential versus non-essential, so I won't beat that horse. But the other one, I think specifically for retailers, is that fulfillment option. When early in my career, I was growing up in the paradigm that, well, if it's not on the shelf, you can't sell it. So we have really small back rooms. Well, with where we are with e-commerce and buy online and pick up on the curb, or ship to home, does that paradigm really hold true anymore? Maybe a back room with inventory is not a bad thing compared to having someone push in a cart and take something off a shelf somebody else put on the shelf to fulfill it another way for a customer. So I think, really looking at those fulfillment options and determining how to best leverage the brick and mortar that they have is going to be critical as they move forward.
That's a great point. I mean, I think I know I've talked to some retailers, folks that have come from the retail industry, and they've said, when stores, particularly if they're non-essential retailers, if they've been deemed non-essential, the stores are closed, but they have all this inventory in there, right? So maybe customers can't go in, but maybe they will be allowed to fulfill orders from all that inventory that's there at the stores, but they didn't have the capabilities, the technology, the know-how to be able to do that, right? So you've got all this trapped inventory in stores all across the country that can be used to fulfill orders, but because they weren't, up the maturity curve from an e-commerce or fulfill from store standpoint, they're hurting versus those that have been able to, that already were down that path where they were able to, fulfill orders from stores or be able to stand it up relatively quickly, are the ones that are to your point, being able to keep that top line going despite, you know, the environment that we're in. So, I mean, I think we could probably talk for, you know, another hour on, you know, on this whole topic of, you know, of supply webs and what that means. But I think the bottom line for me is that, you know, part of supply chains for a better tomorrow is that we have to change our perspectives in terms of the way we've traditionally looked at what we've called supply chains, and look at it from a different lens, and, you know, to use your terminology, a supply web standpoint. So really looking at it through a different, you know, lens. Part of it is unlearning perhaps some of the things that we learned were best practices or leading practices 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, that may not be no longer appropriate or aligned with, you know, with the operating realities. So I think those two things are critical, along with the things that we always talk about, you know, enhanced visibility and leveraging BI and analytics to be able to make these smarter and faster, you know, business decisions. So, John, again, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your insights and ideas, and great food for thought for all of our listeners.
I appreciate it. Always enjoy it, Adrian.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Transportation Insight website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for John, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.